Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything: geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
Okay, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I am your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this show here at American Freedom Radio, AmericanFreedomRadio.com, as well as on my website, which is PorkinsPolicyReview.com, and you can also hear this show rebroadcast later on in the week on Fridays. Well, very excited about today's show, and very excited about the guests that we have on. We are going to be talking about a topic that is one that should be familiar in a general sense to all the listeners, and that is, of course, the influence and direction that the CIA is having when it comes to culture, popular culture in particular. And today we are going to be talking about the relationship between the agency and comic books. And joining me to discuss this is a listener of the show, Ryan Carey. So, Ryan, how are you?
I'm good, Pierce. How are you?
I'm doing very good. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Excellent. Well, Ryan, before we kind of dive into this, explain to the listeners out there a little bit, who is Ryan Carey?
Nobody special. No, I do a lot of freelance writing. I maintain a movie and comic blog, trashfilmguru.wordpress.com, as well as a weekly comic book review column for dailygrindhouse.com, which is kind of a B-movie, drive-in, exploitation cinema website. I do a lot of writing for sites like graphicpolicy.com, which is kind of a politically themed comics website, sequart.org, which is like a academic comic website. So I've been kicking around for a long time. I've dabbled my fingers into the quote-unquote conspiracy or parapolitical world a bit here and there over the years. Done some writing for Steam Shovel Press and some other old-school paper and ink conspiracy publications here and there as the years go on. Certainly as far as a political viewpoint in the parapolitical world goes, I come more from the stream of thinking of folks like Mae Brussel, John Judge, Dave Emery, Alex Constantine, Dave McGowan, people like that more so than I do nonsense like Alex Jones or any of that bullshit.
Oh, well, I mean, you are among friends then, because I am, of course, a huge Mae Brussel fan. And talked about her influence on me and just her shows in general before on this show, on the podcast, and a whole bunch of things. And of course, Alex Constantine, big fan as well, particularly his O.J. Simpson writing.
Oh yeah, that CIA Florida Hollywood mob connection and O.J. Simpson, great stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that is a must read. Well, I guess before we get too off topic, as I said, we are going to be talking about the history and relationship between the CIA and the comic book industry. And this is, I think this sort of direct relationship is fairly new. It's really only kind of flourished in the past few years, although I think it's safe to say that the CIA has always had an interest in comic books in general, but some particular franchises and characters. And over the past few years, we have seen the CIA take more steps towards solidifying this. And again, Tom Secker and I talked about this very topic back for the CIA in Hollywood series when we were talking about American Ultra, which had a very bizarre marketing campaign that was taking place at the San Diego Comic-Con at the time, and the whole marketing campaign seems to, or we think is had to have been cooked up by some CIA, stooge down in a basement somewhere. It's just so bizarre. But anyway, Well, Ryan, before we kind of dive into the specifics of this, and we're going to be talking about a very interesting character called Tom King, why don't you kind of give the listeners a bit of an overview of the kind of the history of the comic book industry and how it functions?
Sure.
I think the way that it does function in today's society it will make sense why the CIA would get involved. But give the listeners a little bit of a background on this.
Yeah, well, comics have always had propaganda value for the government, particularly that was first exploited in World War II, to be specific. What a lot of people don't realize without going all the way back is that Superman, for instance, as the best example, was not always kind of the jingoistic, patriotic, flag-waving, empty suit that he became during the war years. Early on, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, his two creators, were working-class kids from Cleveland, Ohio, who definitely had a blue-collar working-class perspective on issues back then. Early Superman adventures featured him fighting slum landlords, wife-beaters, Pinkertons, strike-breaking scabs, all kinds of things you'd never see in a Superman comic today. In an early issue, he even saves a guy from the electric chair. So Superman definitely had what we would probably consider today more or less an openly leftist political ideology early on. And then during the war years, when Siegel and Shuster shipped off to war and wanted to provide money for their families back home, National Periodical Publications, which later became DC, bought their character, rights to their character in perpetuity for $130. And at that point, they totally switched around Superman's kind of orientation towards being this sort of war propaganda character. And this was not unique to Superman. He was just the most successful example of it. But you had characters like Captain America, the Shield, the Fighting American, all kind of turning up at the same time. Long-standing characters that had nothing to do with the U.S. or even Earth, like Basil Wolverton Spacehawk, who was kind of a spacefaring adventurer who they even implied that his adventures were taking place in the future, suddenly comes down to Earth and becomes a World War II pro-American character. So the propaganda value of comics goes back a long way. And at the time, you have to remember, too, that they were selling in the millions and that they were shipping a lot of these overseas to GIs, and that they were extremely popular reading fare among our troops, particularly in the European theater.
No, absolutely, and again, talking about back several decades ago in the 40s and then maybe even into the 50s, the comic book industry was a lot more I guess had more of a mass appeal as opposed to today, where it is sort of a bit of a niche market. Yeah, I mean well, maybe Ryan, quickly kind of talk about that a little bit again, because we're talking about this is. I think that's why we have this sort of overt stuff, like
Sure.
the Captain Americas and things like that. And maybe you could kind of talk about how that is slowly kind of evolved over time, because now, we could look to any of the Marvel movies are basically like long ads for the Pentagon. So maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to give a good overview, because I'm sure that most of your listeners probably don't have a ton of connection to comic book industry and quote-unquote culture, because it is a niche market, like you say. But it didn't start out that way. What happened was, back when comics were selling in the multi-millions, in the post-war years, the biggest thing was not superheroes. They had kind of died away a little bit after the war, were fizzling out. And the biggest publisher was EC Comics, who later became best known as publishers of Mad Magazine. But what they were most famous for was a line of amazingly inventive, wonderfully illustrated horror comics. And these were selling in the millions again. Kids loved them, were snapping them up, and they had things that probably wouldn't shock too many people today. But their horror and crime comics were pretty spooky, shall we say, for the time. And eventually two-bit psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham took notice of this and wrote a book called Seduction of the Innocent that basically proved to be the death knell of the comic book industry. He basically blamed comic books for corrupting the morals of America's youth, even went so far as to say that they were communist propaganda hidden inside them. And there were congressional hearings about the comic book industry, and they really raked William Gaines, owner of EC, over the coals. And that resulted in the institution of the Comic Book Code Authority, which was like a loose censorship board that had very arbitrary and weird rules and was in place for about the next 50 years. And comic book sales tanked. Comic books kind of came to be seen as sort of delinquent or even degenerate reading material. And then in the very early 60s, there was another shot in the arm to the industry when DC kind of kicked off the Silver Age with the reintroduction of the Flash as a new character. The Flash had been a Golden Age hero. For those who aren't aware, the Golden Age was the early pre-war comics period, and then the Silver Age kicked off in, most people consider it to be about 61, but really started gaining a head of steam in 63 when Marvel came on the scene. And the superhero resurgence was already underway. DC reintroduced the Flash. Superman and Batman, of course, were still around. Mm-hmm. And then they teamed them all up in the Justice League. And that was the first big superhero team book since the days of the old Justice Society. And it was an enormous success. And Marvel, which had been Timely Comics and previous to that Atlas Comics, was a struggling third-rung, fourth-rung publisher. And their owner, Martin Goodman, got a look at the success of this team book. And rumor has it that he then approached his nephew, who was running the company, a guy by the name of Stan Lee, who got it. Yeah, that's how he got into comics. His uncle owned Marvel. And pitched him with this idea of come up with a team book. And Marvel, Timely, Atlas was on the brink of failing at that point. And two visionary comic book artists just happened to be looking for work and landed at their doorstep at the same time. And that would be Jack Kirby, who is pretty much to this day still called the king of comics and probably always will be, just like Elvis will always be the king of rock, I suppose. Jack Kirby's body of work is the single greatest achievement anyone will ever come up with in the comic book industry. He created Captain America along with Joe Simon. He created the entire romance comics genre, which, again, in the 50s, while the boys were buying all the horror stuff, girls were buying romance comics, again, in the millions. Titles like Young Romance were hugely popular. And, yeah, Joe Simon, Jack Kirby created the romance comics genre. And when Jack Kirby landed at Marvel, he created the Fantastic Four, which was the team book that Martin Goodman was looking for. And all the characters in there, Hulk, Iron Man, they brought back Captain America 20 years later under the pretext that he'd been frozen in ice. And while Kirby was creating the chunk of characters in the Marvel Universe, Steve Ditko, who's a little bit more of an idiosyncratic vision, in that he was pretty much a lifelong, and remains to this day, bless him, he's still alive, 86 years old, very devoted acolyte, disciple, however you want to put it, of Ayn Rand and the objectivist movement. So his creations, primary ones that everyone knows, would be Spider-Man and, of course, Doctor Strange, which is the big one right now. And pretty much everything else in the Marvel Universe, except for the Submariner, which was Bill Everett, and Daredevil, Wally Wood, a lot of people involved in the creation of Daredevil, but 75% of the chunk of everything else was the brainchild of Kirby. There was some propaganda kind of below the surface of the Marvel books early on. They kind of tried to capture the youth vibe that was big at the time. And without being overtly political, they sort of tried to covertly side with the more rebellious, young, hey, you go for it, kids attitude of the time. Yeah. And, of course, Kirby's psychedelic artwork was immensely popular in the hippie scene. It was not uncommon at all to go into a VW party bus or some beaded door kind of college dorm room and see some of the incredible double page splash images that Kirby came up with, particularly for titles like Thor and Fantastic Four, just emblazoned over people's walls, painted over things. That was going on, and then there was a falling out between Kirby and Marvel in the early 70s that saw Kirby return to DC. And thereupon, he undertook what I would call to be the first almost sort of mature, politically relevant comics of their time, which was his Fourth World series. A lot of elements of which were, quote-unquote, borrowed by George Lucas for Star Wars later on. Elements like the Force started as the Source in Kirby's Fourth World. Orion, the chief hero, was the son of Darkseid, the chief villain, and stuff. So there's a lot of the parallels were pretty obvious. George Lucas, from what I understand at the time, was a silent partner in a comic book store in the early 70s, and so certainly encountered Kirby's work. And yeah, it's funny how a lot of that really, I would argue, Star Wars films were the first modern superhero movies because so many of their elements were based in the Fourth World. Then concurrently to that, a couple years later, we had the rise of the Superman movie franchise. At this point, thanks to some public shaming, DC finally gave Siegel and Schuster, one of whom had been working as a courier delivering things to the DC office. That's how shabbily they were treated. Finally consented to give them each a pension and permanent credit as creators of Superman, a situation that persists to this day. So they get a little bit, their families get residuals and things like that, but nothing like true creator ownership like we see in the industry today. Comic books at that point were selling all right. And then as we rolled into the 80s, of course, there was a tremendous resurgence in comic book interest for a time, thanks largely in part to The Dark Knight Returns, Frank Miller's famous Batman series, which basically became, I would say, the basis of the entire Hollywood Batman image from that point on.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen blew everything up and deconstructed the superhero and everything about it right in plain view for everyone to see. And I think it's safe to say in most people's minds probably remains the most literate and best constructed superhero story of all time. I don't think it's a reach to say that at all. So those in that, and along with the rise with Art Spiegelman's Mouse, right about the same time, which got serious academic interest. Spiegelman came more out of the underground stream of creators, people like R. Crumb and S. Clay Wilson and Kim Deitch, and names from the '60s who are still at it today. So with this sort of resurgence in interest in comic books, there came along a speculators market, unfortunately. And this was a huge boon to the industry for a time, but ultimately it's undoing as well. You had Marvel, DC printing off 6 cover variants with foil embossing and all this stuff. And it was selling by the millions again, but with this idea that in 2 weeks it was going to be worth 5 times what you paid for it, even though there's 2.5 million copies of this comic floating around. So before there was the tech bubble and before there was the housing bubble, trust me when I say there was the comic book bubble. And at the same time this was going on, most of Marvel's top creators, certainly their top artists, finally kind of got sick of the raw deal they were getting with these page rates and how much more money the publishers were making than they were, and split to form their own company, Image Comics. And this was a huge step, and unfortunately also kind of fed the speculator bubble at the same time. Image Comics, their first issues and things were selling huge, but even to this day now, you can go into your 25 and 50 cent bins at your local comic shop and find remainder copies of some of those early Image comics. They just printed so damn many of them. So the speculator bubble finally burst, and in some respects, the comics industry this was about the early 90s, mid 90s, and in many respects, the comic book industry is still struggling to put itself back together from that. So while you've seen the properties, the intellectual property, particularly of the big two companies, take off like nobody's business, in Hollywood, print sales of comic books are a fraction of what they used to be. Now, it's turned around a little bit in recent years. This year was the best year for comic sales, I believe, in about 15, 16 years. And things are sort of headed in the right direction. But what they're stuck with, particularly the business model of the big two, Marvel and DC, is that they're basically relaunching their line every year or two to revive flagging interest and get those first issue sales numbers back again. So about 5 years ago, DC relaunched their whole line with the New 52. They started their whole universe over. And it was a tremendous sales success for the first 5-6 months and then started to fizzle out. And Marvel is in a really weird spot where they are relaunching their line from scratch literally every year and a half or so.
Yeah.
They've started all over again 4 times in the last 5 years. First with Marvel Now, then they had All New Marvel Now, then All New All Different Marvel Now, and now we're on the 4th one, and it's just called Marvel Now again. And I would imagine at some point we're going to get to Marvel What Now. And then DC, about 5 years on from New 52, that finally ran out of gas, and they relaunched again with something they called Rebirth, which is, again, right now still in the midst of a tremendous success wave in terms of sales, and have started everything back over at number 1 there again. And this one's particularly controversial in that it's basically, from my view at least, an open declaration of creative bankruptcy in that the main plot line underpinning all the Rebirth titles, it's a big, giant, essentially 2-year crossover that will eventually see all the DC characters come into conflict with the characters from the Watchmen universe, which have always been kept separate due to the wishes of their creators. But DC doesn't give a rat's ass about Alan Moore or Dave Gibbons anymore. And so that's where we're at. So I would today, from a market that once sold millions, today your top-selling comics are selling usually in the neighborhood of about 150,000 units a month. And your low-selling comics can be down around literally 4,000 or 5,000 copies. Now, that's not including digital sales, which are another thing, and those are never made public. And then trade paperback collection sales. I mean, that's a big part of the market now, in that monthly single issues of pretty much every comic about every 6 months are just bound together in a trade paperback, and a trade market is how a lot of readers do it now. So, and economically that makes more sense because cover prices are high now. DC's $2.99, Marvel and Image are $3.99, and trade paperbacks are $10-12. Gets you 6 months worth of a comic. So. That's the current economic setup of the industry. On the one hand, the intellectual property is worth more than ever. Disney bought Marvel about 10 years ago, and Time Warner's owned DC for a long time. So the IP is worth more than ever, but the monthly sales of comics are, they've rebounded a bit, but they're still a fraction of what they used to be. And the big entertainment conglomerates keep them around because of their value down the road as platforms for the next movie franchise or TV franchise or things like that. But don't kid yourself. Just because the latest Avengers movie is making $1 billion worldwide, the Avengers comic book is still only selling 50, maybe 60,000 a month. So it's a weird dichotomy.
Oh no, it's funny too. Again, the mainstreaming of comic books. Like you said, a lot of people are going to go see the Avengers movie, but God forbid they actually go to their local comic book shop and actually pick up some comics. And again, the I don't know, the way that everything in movies is a reboot. that is mirrored in so many comics where it's just a reboot of a reboot of a reboot, nothing original. Which is why I am such a big fan of Image. We were talking off air about some of the old titles that I used to follow a lot, and that is why Image Comics is great. So just a little plug for them. But
right now but again here, and this will tie into what we're talking about coming up, is Image books are creator owned. They're not owned by the publisher. So when they're things like The Walking Dead, that doesn't really put much money in Image Comics' pocket, but it puts a lot of money in Robert Kirkman's pocket. So, and that's down the line, all Image books, except, a few exceptions. There's little sub-studios, like Kirkman owns an outfit called Skybound. And if you see like the Skybound stamp on a book, that's owned by the Skybound studio. But 90% of your Image comics are owned by the writers and artists who are putting them out, which is great as far as commercial exploitation down the line goes. But the one thing that's a little bit tricky is they don't pay a page rate. So basically, if you do an Image, you better hope it gets picked up in trade, because once a trade paperback comes out, that's mostly money right into the creators' pockets. But quite literally, those first 5 or 6 months before those first trade collections come out, the Image creators are working on their books for free in the hopes that it takes off later. And usually they do. When they do, it's, the economics are amazing. Like Kieran Gillen is a guy who's done writing for both Marvel and Image. He's got a very popular Image series called The Wicked and Divine that I guess has been optioned for TV. And that thing sells, we're talking 15, 16, 17,000 a month. While that was going on, he was also writing Darth Vader for Marvel, and that thing was selling 100,000. And he was not shy about saying he got a much bigger paycheck at the end of the day from Wicked and the Divine than he did for Darth Vader.
No, it is also a very difficult industry to work in, and to actually make a name for yourself. But moving on to the main thrust of this, I think you just did a wonderful overview of the sort of history of comics and how the comic book industry works. But there is something a little sinister going on with a few people in particular. And again, the listeners are all, I'm sure everybody out there is familiar with the influence that the Pentagon has in all of these Marvel films, be it the Avengers, Captain America, Iron Man, name it. All sorts of Pentagon help in making these movies, from personnel to advisors to just general influence. But Ryan, you emailed me about a very interesting character by the name of Tom King, who was in the clandestine services for several years with the CIA before going on to become a huge success in the world of comic books, and particularly with DC and this new Batman series. And I guess just starting off, I mean, who is Tom King? I know he was an intern briefly for Marvel and DC, and then moved to Washington, and then shortly thereafter became a member of the CIA. So explain a little bit, who is Tom King?
Well, this is all pieced together from statements that King has made publicly, so we're not talking any secrets here. And I should be quick to say that the success that he's having in the industry is not undeserved in any way. Tom King is a great writer, and some of his books are some of the best things out there right now, and we'll get into that in a minute. But yeah, his background is one that has me scratching my head a little bit. Here's a guy who apparently interned at DC at some point in the 90s and was planning on pursuing a career as a comic book freelancer. Then, as the legend goes, and that I don't know what else to call a story like this, he apparently got so pissed off about 9/11 that he went and joined the CIA to fight for his country. Didn't enlist in the military, mind you. Went down and joined the CIA. I don't know how many people did that, but that's what he says he did. And at that point, after his training and all that was up, he was assigned as a case officer in Iraq and spent a good number of years. I don't know how many for sure over there, but if you look up some videos of interviews of him on YouTube and stuff, he says he's proud of the work he did over there. I guess someone had to be. And after his time in the CIA was up, I think we're looking at maybe 4 up. Let's be honest here quickly. I come from the point of view that you don't quit working for the CIA any more than you quit working for the mafia.
Oh, yeah.
Once you're in, you're in. And so once his time in Iraq was up, he came back home and went right to work at D.C. And the first assignment he got was a book called Grayson, which is, for those who are unfamiliar, was Dick Grayson is the former Robin, Batman's sidekick, who went on his own and became Nightwing. Then his secret identity apparently was revealed to the public, so everyone knew who he was. And then in a real head-scratching move, they decided, well, okay, now that everyone knows who he is, let's make him an undercover spy. Go figure that one out. So they relaunched his book, and rather than called Nightwing, it was now called Grayson. And presumably King was on there for his experience in the espionage field. He was kind of shepherded or guided through this process with his co-writer on a book, a guy named Tim Seeley, who's another very good veteran comics writer. He's got an Image series called Revival that I think will probably be making its way on a television at some point. So basically, King was being groomed in with the help of a co-writer on this first assignment. And I don't know, I never really read much of this Grayson thing because the premise seemed pretty absurd. But it was fairly well received and sold all right, but not fantastic. And then he moved. His next assignment was taking over the character of the Vision for Marvel. And the Vision, for those unfamiliar, is like an android type character. And he had a really unique premise for this book where the Vision had built himself a android family. And it quickly falls apart. But there are some interesting subtexts at work in this Vision comic. Like the Vision's wife, in the very first issue, kills a villain who's coming over to attack the family. And of course, superheroes by and large don't kill, or when, the Punisher is an exception, I guess, or Wolverine, but by and large we don't have our superheroes killing. And when they do, it's kind of portrayed as like a tragic inevitability sort of thing. But this was weird in that the Vision's wife, who killed this villain, then buried him in their backyard, was definitely portrayed as the most sympathetic character in this series. And then in order to cover up what she did later, she accidentally hospitalizes a guy who saw it happen and kills their kid, who was a schoolmate of one of the Vision's robotic android kids. So basically, the most sympathetic character in this Vision series, which just wrapped up, was a killer android. I don't know what else to say. Trust me, it's a great comic. It has a very kind of Philip K. Dick sensibility to it. And I definitely recommend it as good reading. But some of the subtext in there is a little bit, shall we say, fishy. The same time this was going on, he was given the assignment by DC to relaunch their dormant Omega Men sci-fi franchise. And again, this is a terrific comic, but this has probably the most overt political subtext of any of King's work, in that it's pro-torture right off the bat. There is a villainous entity that they're fighting against that is like a religious fundamentalist sort of interstellar intergalactic sect that's taken over the galaxy, that's clearly meant to be a stand-in for like an ISIS type of Islamic caliphate idea. And it's definitely an ends justify the means type of message here, because the Omega Men do a lot of beyond questionable shit to win the day at the end. Torture, forced brainwashing, all this stuff. But by the end, it's all shown to be worth it because they save the day from this evil fundamentalist sect. Is it well written? Sure. And it's superbly drawn by Barnaby Bagenda, who's got a terrific future ahead of him. I mean, the art in this book will blow your mind. But yes, very questionable. And speaking of questionable, there was a questionable move that happened about halfway through this. The Omega Men was part of a soft reboot from about a year and a half ago from DC called DCU, as in YOU. Like they're aiming their comics for you was the idea. And it was a complete flop. It was a disaster. And pretty much everything related to this DCU initiative was canceled. But Omega Men was canceled and brought back, which you almost never see. And there was no particularly public outcry for it because nobody was reading it. I mean, the book didn't sell worth a damn. And so they announced that it was initially slated to run 12 issues. And then they said, well, we're going to have to wrap it up at number 6. And occasionally you'll see things like this, and there will be some kind of an email campaign or a social media campaign to save the book. No such thing for Omega Men. Nobody really noticed that they dropped the axe on it. But weirdly enough, just a few days later, they reversed course and said, we're going to let this one run 12 issues after all. And this was just one of a few really kind of charmed things almost that have happened with Tom King's career that seem a little bit funny to me. The next embarked on is, to date, his best, which is a book called The Sheriff of Babylon. Now, this is a book from DC's creator-owned Vertigo line. For those who may not be super familiar, Vertigo is an imprint that's been around for about 20 years now. His famous books are things like Neil Gaiman's Sandman is the huge thing that came from their Fables. A lot of very successful comics franchises were launched in the pages of Vertigo titles, but it's really been a label that's been dying on the vine recently. But I'd say about a year and a half ago now, they announced kind of a major Vertigo relaunch. They were going to put a new emphasis on the line, and they were rolling out 12 new titles in the space of 3 months. And The Sheriff of Babylon was one of those titles, and it was supposed to have an 8-issue shelf life. It was, a finite 8-issue series. And this is obviously drawn from King's own experiences in Iraq because the main character is a U.S. Quote-unquote contractor. I guess, is it okay to finally call them mercenaries or what?
Yeah, right. Different euphemisms.
Yeah, he's a contractor over there assigned to training the nominally independent Iraq police force. And in the midst of this, there is a murder that he's got to solve. And it shows a lot of different characters with a lot of different agendas. It's very fascinating. But here's the really strange thing that I would think. I'm just shocked there was no discussion of this really in the comics community at all, which is that King and DC both admitted that before these issues went to press, they were all vetted by the CIA. Which tells me that he's still, even if he's still not officially working for him, he's got some kind of handler at the very least. And so they're admitting that they're giving the CIA up or down veto power over what gets published in one of their comics. That to me is just nuts. But, when you try to get this discussion going in the comic book community, it is, oh my God, that is so cool. They think it's terrific that a guy with King's background is working in the industry. And they think, oh my God, this must be a really important comic if it's got to make national security clearance. Well, seriously, that's how. Yeah.
No. Let's take a moment there and just kind of explore that because again, I think Tom King's sort of trajectory does, it is sort of interesting. Again, you say when he's going to get a series that gets dropped and then it gets picked up again, but that is really important to understand, that the CIA was vetting these books before they were actually published, because then the question arises, of course, what was taken out? Were there things that were taken out? Were there things that were altered? Did dialogue get changed? Were characters changed? And of course, that's something we'll probably never know.
We won't.
The CIA's records for their work in Hollywood are so spotty. I'm sure they probably didn't even write anything down for Tom King and the comic book industry. Although it would be interesting to kind of FOIA that and to see. But briefly, is there anything in Sheriff of Babylon that does sort of just shout out CIA?
Yeah, actually, I'll give you a two-part answer to that question. Yes, but not in the way that you would think. There's not a particular plot point or line of dialogue or something that just screams the company must have had their fingers on this. What to me screams CIA is in how obviously neutered this book is. Let me explain that a little better, I guess. This is a book set in the middle of the Iraq War, showcasing corruption on all sides that is almost bizarrely apolitical. I mean, it does not take a stand against, even though it clearly depicts some of the just under the table madness going on all around, right? Our central character is sort of portrayed as kind of a hapless, clueless stooge almost, who's only vaguely aware of what's happening around him. Meanwhile, of course, pretty much every single Iraqi character is shown to have an agenda, a pretty duplicitous agenda. Even the ones that are
the good guys, quote unquote.
Well, no, even the ones where it's shown in a more sympathetic light, like why they might be doing what they're doing, why they might be double and triple dealing with everyone just to stay alive. There's one issue that's just focused on one guy's just brutal torture that is one of the most I'll put it to you this way. The fact that made it by the CIA censors kind of tells me that they basically want you to know what they're doing over there and what they have done over there. Because it's pretty explicit. It's pretty in your face. So this is meant to kind of drive home some sympathy for this guy and why he's kind of working basically every angle he can. But at the same time, those things, and they do show that there are Americans with less than pure motives over there. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really take much of a firm political stand. And all these things are presented more as intrigues growing out of the central murder mystery question. But here's the interesting thing. Like I said before, this thing was supposed to run 8 issues, all right? While all these other Vertigo titles that were part of this 12-title relaunch were getting axed left and right. I mean, you had ongoing titles that they canceled at number 6. Miniseries that were supposed to run 12 issues that they cut off at 6. I mean, this relaunch didn't take off too well at all, okay? And in the midst of all this, really the only titles to survive were Sheriff of Babylon and something called Unfollow, which is an interesting book. But the reason Unfollow survived is because it was optioned for TV. So even though it's only selling 4,500 or 5,000 copies a month, it was optioned for a full season right off the bat from ABC, which is curious because ABC is Disney, Marvel, and they optioned this DC property. But in the midst of all these titles getting axed, Sheriff of Babylon mysteriously gets extended from 8 issues to 12 and picked up, quote-unquote, renewed for a quote-unquote second season, even though it wasn't selling any better than any of the others. And it has no TV or movie options attached to it. And if you get to the point when you're reading it, the first 12-issue run just finished. And when you get to the point at number 8, there's no way it could have ended at that point. He couldn't have. So I don't think that, it wouldn't have made sense to chop it off at number 8. They were nowhere near finished with the story. So it's really bizarre what happened behind the scenes there. I'm glad it's coming back. Don't get me wrong. Sheriff of Babylon is a terrific comic. I just cobbled together my top 10 list for the year, and I think I had, let me see, I had Sheriff of Babylon as the second best comic of the year, second only to Alan Moore's Providence. So that tells you it's a pretty damn good comic, which it is. But, there are subtexts to it that are a little bit, I almost hesitate to say racist, because, yes, the Americans aren't shown to be awesome, but every single Iraqi in there, even the ones that they're trying to show in a more sympathetic light, is shown to be some kind of a scheming, double-dealing, can't trust them bastard.
Well, and that's also typical CIA propaganda, and if you ever watch like the show Homeland, for instance.
I've never seen it, but I've listened to some of your stuff about it.
Well, you should check it out. Especially with the context of Sheriff of Babylon, because again, in Homeland, while the CIA may not be portrayed as nice, ultimately they're necessary, and ultimately the bad guys are always so much worse that you sort of accept that, it's okay to drone, this wedding or torture that person or whatnot, because
exactly,
secretly all the other, the bad guys are, they're this pervasive force that are everywhere. We can't trust any of them, and they're all evil. So it's always sort of justified, which it very much sounds like the kind of the overall message in say a Sheriff of Babylon type comic.
That's exactly right, Pierce. And like what you've got, I'll give you an example, just a shorthand example. Like, clearly the power player in this Sheriff of Babylon is a Western-educated Iraqi woman, okay? And our kind of hapless, clueless protagonist is actually having a kind of under-the-cover clandestine fling with her, okay? And he gets her pregnant, she gets an abortion and things like that, and she's nearly assassinated. All these terrible, things are happening around her, and she's shown to have a pretty rough life. But at the same time, she's ultimately shown to be a duplicitous character, because she is working every single angle in this, in and around this green zone area. So even the most, that's the pattern that is in Sheriff of Babylon, is that even the most sympathetic Iraqi characters are somehow shown to be a little bit worse and more devious than even the dumbest American ones.
Oh, and again, too, we've no way of knowing this, of course, but it would be fascinating to see. Was this all King's writing and storyline ideas, and the CIA maybe just told him to tone certain things down? Or were they giving him ideas, for certain storylines and stuff? But
according to the publicity material and the interview material that's out there, all they were doing was thumbs up or thumbs downing his scripts. That it all came from him. And I'm inclined to believe that, simply because it's written very much in the style of his other work. His style tends to be kind of a very sparse, kind of rapid-fire dialogue, kind of minimal adjectives right out of the Hemingway school almost, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's very quick, precise dialogue, and he's got a real talent for establishing characterization very quickly and with an economy of words. So, like I say, I cannot fault. I'm glad they extended the book. As a creative decision, I can't fault anything that's happened in Tom King's career, because these have all been good comics. But again, he seems to be having kind of a charmed life, and that only has continued after Sheriff of Babylon, because, well, here's the thing. Like, when I've tried to explain this to comic book fans and why I'm kind of suspicious of this setup, they were always like, well, what the hell does the CIA care about a bunch of low-selling books like Omega Men and Sheriff of Babylon and things like that? These are not heavy-duty propaganda tools, right? But what it was is kind of a vehicle for getting Tom King. What it was is a vehicle for getting Tom King established in the comic book world. And again, he kind of had a charmed thing here in that DC, in the middle of the Sheriff of Babylon, signed him to an exclusive contract. Now, these are what freelancers live for, because comic book freelancing is a rough gig. You've got no health insurance. You've got no pension. You're just getting paid your page rate, and you can be fired from your book or replaced with someone cheaper, some kid they just met at a convention who handed them a portfolio of sketches, right? And will work for half your page rate. That can happen all the time. So what you want is an exclusive contract. And King was working for both Marvel and DC concurrently with his the Vision over at Marvel, and then Sheriff of Babylon and still Grayson and Omega Men going at DC. And they signed him to an exclusive, and it had an interesting carve-out in there for him, which is that he didn't have to quit his Marvel work right away. They allowed him to continue on the Vision, even though a lot of these exclusives, the typical terms are like, okay, the minute you sign this contract, you're working for us, right? Mm. So the Vision was at maybe issue 5, 6, 7, something like that when they did this exclusive. And they allowed him to stay there and finish his 12-issue run on that one, which is interesting, a pretty nice deal. I'm glad they did, because the Vision was a terrific story again. So I'm glad it was allowed to play out its 12-issue run. But it shows, again, kind of a double standard that I'm sure other creators would kill for, There are so many people out there that would love to see their low-selling but good titles kept alive, or have their cancellation first, or being allowed to work with another publisher for a period of 6 months while they're under an exclusive with someone else. These are sweet deals.
Well, and explain to the next iteration of King's trajectory, because then, of course, I liked how you sort of said that again, titles like Sheriff of Babylon, Omega Men, all those that establishes him, and like in CIA parlance, this is his cover story. This is he's now this
it's his jacket.
Yeah, exactly. And he's very creative, and he's this, visionary type comic book writer who's, these critically acclaimed titles that don't sell well. And then he's basically handed DC's most profitable and important series, Batman. Explain this.
Yeah. So there's what you got to understand about Batman is that even in the midst of some of the low sales problems that have been plaguing the industry, and even in the midst of kind of the interest in the DC New 52 relaunch that we talked about earlier, even in the midst of all that, Batman is far and away the consistent number one title in all of comics. Occasionally, there will be some crossover from Marvel or DC that might drop it down to number 2 for a month or two. But Batman sales are so consistent that Comics Beat, which tracks, which kind of analyzes the Diamond sales charts. For those unfamiliar, Diamond is the monopoly that owns all comic distribution. Comics Beat is a really good blog with excellent sales chart analysis, and they use Batman as their 100% sale line benchmark for all books. So basically, they're judging every title up against how well Batman sells. Okay, so it's the consistent number one book. And for the last 5 years during this New 52 run, they have had arguably the most critically and commercially acclaimed creative team to ever work on Batman. They had a writer named Scott Snyder, who is an English professor at Sarah Lawrence College, and then an artist from the old Image days named Greg Capullo. And they produced a Batman run for the ages. I mean...
Ryan, hold on. We're coming up on the break right now.
Sure.
We'll be returning in the second hour with more of Ryan Carey. So stay tuned.
the world's meeting place. American.
It's practically narcotic.
Freedom.
Oh, yes. I like very much.
Radio.
You're an American institution.
American Freedom Radio.
Did you know there are 3 million edible food plants on Earth, and none have the nutritional value of the hemp plant? HempUSA.org offers you hemp protein powder. It does not contain chemicals or THC, is non-GMO, and is 100% gluten-free. Hemp protein powder burns fat, builds muscle, contains 53% protein, and feeds the body the nutrients it needs. Call 888-910-4367 and see what our powder, seeds, and oil can do for you. Only at HempUSA.org. HempUSA.org introduces 3 brand new detox formulations of microplant powder. Brain Fuel for depression, bipolar disorders, and stress. Total Care, anti-cancer agent that cleans the liver and organs and increases memory. Rejuvenate, invigorates and heals the body, mind, and spirit. These products are your alternative to pharmaceuticals. Call 888-910-4367 and like us on Facebook. We ship worldwide. Only at HempUSA.org.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the war in the Persian Gulf. You know my favorite part of that war? It's the first war we ever had that was on every channel plus cable. We like war. We're a warlike people. We like war because we're good at it. And you know why we're good at it? Because we get a lot of practice. This country's only 200 years old, and already we've had 10 major wars. We average a major war every 20 years in this country, so we're good at it. And it's a good thing we are. We're not very good at anything else anymore. Huh? Can't build a decent car. Got no steel industry left. Can't educate our young people. Can't get health care to our old people. Now, you probably noticed I don't feel about that war the way we were told we were supposed to feel about that war, the way we were ordered and instructed by the United States government to feel about that war. You see, I tell you, my mind doesn't work that way. I got this real moron thing I do. It's called thinking. And I'm not a very good American because I like to form my own opinions. I don't just roll over when I'm told to. Sad to say, most Americans just roll over on command. Not me. I have certain rules I live by. My first rule, I don't believe anything the government tells me. Nothing. Zero. Nope. And I don't take very seriously the media or the press in this country, who in the case of the Persian Gulf War were nothing more than unpaid employees of the Department of Defense, and who most of the time function as kind of an unofficial public relations agency for the United States government. So I don't listen to them. I don't get all choked up about yellow ribbons and American flags. I consider them to be symbols, and I leave symbols to the symbol-minded.
You're listening to AmericanFreedomRadio.com, the network who perseveres in delivering intelligent debate, constructive dialogue with true independence. The freedom to broadcast the truth is not free at all. So what is American Freedom Radio worth to you? The empowering information with fun, honest and pure integrity behind it provides an example to follow. Friendships to flourish with the moral altruism that pulls no punches. The hosts sacrifice and show remarkable discipline in their duty to deliver quality radio and service to the community with strength, wisdom and loyalty. The founders of AFR wish to thank you personally for sharing your views and insights to make the best radio and alternative media. Now it's time for you to give something back and play a vital role in the future of America. Be as generous with us as we've been with you. Click on the donate banner at AmericanFreedomRadio.com or volunteer by emailing AmericanFreedomRadio@ymail.com. Vaccine, psychotropic drugs and artillery batteries not included.
No rules, no rules, no taboo topics, no fear of doom, We are American Freedom Radio. American Freedom Radio. Porkins Policy Radio, offering a unique perspective on everything. Geopolitics, culture creation, the reality of the world we live in. Coming to you live from New York City, your host, Pierce Redmond.
welcome back to Porkins Policy Radio. If you are just joining right now, we have been speaking with Ryan Carey all about the comic book industry, this fascinating character, Tom King, comic book writer, and his connection to the CIA. So, before we cut to the break there, Ryan, you were talking about Batman in particular, and Tom King's connection to Batman, but more specifically, again, we were talking about how important this is. For people, I think everyone understands that Batman as a franchise, as a movie franchise in particular, is worth a lot of money. But you were kind of explaining how much it's really worth in the comic book world. So continue on with that a little bit.
Sure. Batman is pretty much the primo assignment, the gig you want to get, the top of the mountain for a comic book freelancer working for the big two, for Marvel or DC. The creative teams on there have a history of long and very popular runs. Grant Morrison had a 7-year run on Batman, and this was followed by this Scott Snyder, Greg Capullo team I was just telling you about, who had a 5-year run. Immensely successful. Really redefined the character for a new generation. Hugely popular with both critics and readers. And like I say, consistently the #1 book, barring the occasional hiccup, from some kind of stupid multi-hero crossover thing or something. So Batman is the mountaintop. Batman is the gig to get. And it was so prized as a kind of a gig that DC had kind of been struggling with a plan of succession for when getting ahead of myself, for when Snyder and Capullo left. And they'd clearly been grooming a guy named James Tynion IV, who was actually one of Scott Snyder's understudies / writing students at Sarah Lawrence. And he'd been doing the occasional fill-in issue or the occasional backup story or things like that. He was clearly Snyder was grooming him along to kind of be his successor. And also, at the same time, you would hear that DC wanted to put a more established name on the book to kind of keep the momentum going, and that names like Brian Azzarello were being dropped, and a lot of comics veterans with a good track record. And so at the same time that Snyder and Capullo finally decided to leave the book after 5 years, DC underwent this rebirth initiative we were talking about earlier, which is 5 years on from the New 52. They wrapped up all their books at issue number 52. The company is obsessed with that number for some reason, and started everything over from #1 again. So this made whoever landed the Batman gig an even more prestigious assignment. Not only were you getting to follow up the most successful and critically acclaimed Batman run probably in 20 or 30 years, but you were getting a new #1 to start over at too. So this was going to be, Batman #1 was probably going to sell 200,000, 250,000 type copies. And like I say, clearly it looked like this guy, James Tynion IV, was the early favorite to land the job among speculators in kind of the comics gossip circles. But other bigger names were being dropped too. And then out of nowhere, when DC made their announcements, they had a big panel at WonderCon, the big LA-based comic convention earlier this year, to announce all their creative teams for all their relaunched titles with the new Rebirth initiative. And they announced right there, Tom King, a name totally out of the blue, was going to be the leader of Batman. And this is a guy who the huge majority, overwhelming majority of Batman readers probably weren't even terribly familiar with the name. Because like we were discussing earlier, most of King's books, things like The Vision and Omega Men were maybe 15,000, 16,000 copy sellers. And things like Sheriff of Babylon, honestly, was selling around 5,000, 6,000. Sales on these books are low. But lo and behold, certainly with a track record of creative success behind him, but no track record of sales success whatsoever. Anything but a track record of really poor sales under his belt. King lands the biggest plum assignment in all of comics. And they also team him up with a couple of artists on the book who are guaranteed to sell copies too. The DC Rebirth thing is a little tricky in that rather than typical monthly comics, they are every 2 weeks. So they're double shipping these books. So basically between Batman will come out 1 week, next week Detective, then Batman, then Detective. Okay. For those unaware, Detective Comics is the secondary Batman title. So basically you're getting a Batman comic every week. And it's the same story with Superman. You'll get Superman 1 week, Action Comics the next, so that every week you're getting a new Superman comic, that type of deal. So basically, this is a breakneck schedule for any freelancer working on these books. So they're kind of splitting up the art chores. And they have a guy named David Finch, who's a well-established, very popular superhero artist, doing half of the issues of Batman. And then a guy named Mikel Janin, who's definitely a rising star, super talented artist, was going to be the alternate second artist on Batman. So King is teamed up with both veteran, super popular, fan favorite artist, and then a guy whose career is just taken off, and who was actually his artist on Nightwing. So they have some history working together. So he's got great artists with him on it. He's handed the most plum assignment in all of comics, and this, I think, is the end game strategy for why the CIA would want to sort of sneak a guy into the comic book industry. Not that they're sneaking him in. I mean, they're open about his background. But this is where the propaganda value comes in. Yes, things like Omega Man and the Vision don't have a lot of propaganda value, but if you look at the Batman franchise, now you're looking at $1 billion character right there, multi-billion-dollar character. If DC was to go bankrupt and sell off its properties, I would bet you that the rights to Batman would sell to whoever bought them for a couple few $1 billion just right off the bat.
Easily.
So that's what's going on as far as where he is now. And it's interesting in that definitely the new Batman series got off to a really rocky start. The first few issues, in fact, his first 5-6 part storyline was actually freaking terrible and the worst thing I've ever seen him write. But now that he's kind of easing into the second storyline and he's got this Mikel Janin with him as artist, they really seem to work well together and have a good synergy. And this is an excellent story, but has open intelligence connections to it in that Batman is going to work as an operative of the Suicide Squad, who I think most people who've seen the movie are familiar with the notion that these are villains recruited by a top secret government agency via means of an implant in their head that'll blow them up if they step out of line. So Batman's going to work for Amanda Waller, the ruthless Suicide Squad leader, and is basically operating as an undercover government operative now, which is totally new territory for Batman. And the thing you have to realize is that pretty much every Batman movie you see is based on comic book scripts from years before. So like the Nolan Batman trilogy, some of these flicks, like that third Dark Knight Rises flick, you can see elements from 3, 4, 5 different famous Batman series all incorporated into that plot. So the basis of these things is definitely the comic books, and there's sliding propaganda value in there that I can guarantee you will probably turn up down the road as part of the Ben Affleck relaunched Batman. And because Affleck's got some intelligence agency connections himself with Argo.
Oh, that's something I hadn't even thought about until you're just mentioning it. But again, I mean, the same thing with, Ben Affleck's career basically being padded out by the CIA.
Yep.
As you mentioned, Argo, but of course, too, Sum of All Fears. He's had his own history and again, Argo, not the greatest movie in the world.
No.
Strictly leaving aside the propaganda value of Argo, it's just not that great a movie. It's actually pretty boring, and it's just not as exciting as you would think. Yet it's the critical acclaim and the Oscar and all of that kind of nonsense. Again, it was up against Zero Dark 30, which is like a story in and of itself that they both were nominated. And then boom, what does he go on to do? The one of the most CIA friendly, if not CIA, supported stars. Then he goes on to do Batman, which again, alongside alongside Tom King, moving into the Batman series. But Ryan, maybe you could kind of flesh this out a little bit more, because I do see that Batman is, of course, the, I think, character or franchise that the CIA would be interested in. And maybe we'll get Tom Secker on a future show. Maybe the three of us can talk about this, because Tom actually does believe that the CIA has been involved in some sense behind the scenes, or at least with the tacit support of the Batman movies. But I think Batman is the perfect kind of CIA type character, and maybe you can flesh that out a little bit as well. But again, he's this sort of vigilante. He doesn't have superpowers. He does rely on his wits, his strength, and his ingenuity in creating gadgets, which is again very CIA-esque. He employs some sort of violent methods, but of course it's all justified in the end. So I don't know, Tom. I mean, maybe, Ryan, explain a little bit why the CIA would be so interested in a Batman.
Well, first of all, just obviously because of the wide-scale dissemination of whatever propaganda they want to sneak in there. You have 3 Batman films that have earned over $1 billion at the box office, right?
Yeah.
And then you've got one, the most recent one, Batman versus Superman, which is weirdly kind of being portrayed as sort of a box office disappointment, but still made something like $980 million, damn near $1 billion
right.
worldwide. And then if you were to translate, say, the old Michael Keaton Batman flicks into modern dollars, I'm sure those are probably worth damn near $1 billion each, too, in today's dollars. So you're disseminating your propaganda message far and wide. But Batman, to me, I agree with all the points you made about how he'd be perfect as kind of a CIA operative character. But another one, too, that is automatically in there is kind of a plausible deniability factor. If you were to send Batman in as an undercover government operative into places, he can just deny it right off the bat because everyone knows Batman has a reputation for working alone and doing his own thing. So that's a big one. But it's very interesting to see how this is playing out in terms of in the current storyline, which is called I Am Suicide, because he's, recruited as an undercover Suicide Squad operative. He's going in on a mission that the government wants him to, but that also ties into his own self-interest in that he gets to take on and get his revenge on Bane, who everybody knows from the third Christopher Nolan Batman film. So that's a big thing because Bane is the guy who broke his back and almost killed him. So he gets to settle his scores, and the whatever Task Force X is the real name of Suicide Squad, they get to kind of settle their scores with him too, and it's shown to be kind of a mutually beneficial relationship. But I thought it was interesting, the timing of it, in that the first storyline that King did when he took over Batman was this little, I think it 5-6 issues long, and like I said, it completely sucked. And it's like he was just mailing it in, right? And it's almost like he was struggling to find his voice with the character and not really giving it a solid effort. Now, granted, when you've got to crank out 2 issues a month instead of 1, it's tough to do as high quality of a work. But then the minute he gets into this second storyline with these undercover operative connotations to it, it's like a like a switch flipped. He's suddenly writing Batman with a really clear and confident sort of voice and internal monologue that is unlike anything we've seen before, but feels right for the character. And the story's moving at a great clip. It's like he's really found his feet instantly. And I can guarantee you, I shouldn't guarantee anything, but I can nearly guarantee you that these scripts are, if not being openly vetted by the CIA, are being watched with keen interest by and being assessed for their propaganda value for later films in this forthcoming Affleck Batman series. Oh, and an interesting comic book connection we missed out earlier. Speaking of Argo again real quickly, do you know who drew all the storyboards and concept sketches for the fake Argo movie that was never made?
Oh,
in real life?
The name is escaping me right now. Who is it?
It was Jack Kirby.
Yes, right, exactly, of course.
Yep. Jack Kirby drew all the concept sketches for the Argo movie that was never made.
Yeah, right. No, and the sketches are bizarre and definitely worth checking out. But
they're amazing. Yeah.
It just. To go off on a little tangent there, I wonder how much Kirby knew about what was going on, or if he really was just doing this, thinking that it was going to be a movie. I assume so.
Jack Kirby.
Hush.
Jack Kirby barely ever got away from his drawing board. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Here's a guy who just valued hard work and working all the time and had a family to feed and raise. And basically, the demands and the page count and things that were imposed upon him at that time were like nothing anybody in comics could do today. When he had his contract with DC in the early 70s, when he was doing his Fourth World books and stuff, his contract called for 15 pages written, drawn, and edited per week.
Jeez.
Per week. So we're talking, that's like a 80, 90-hour work week guaranteed right there.
Well, Ryan, getting back to Batman again, and I find another factor in this is so interesting because again, we can look at we can look at the Marvel universe a bit, and we can look at the Avengers. We can look at the Nick Fury character. Again, I think that's a creation of Kirby. Definitely his wonderful, and the old Nick Fury comics, the drawings are super psychedelic.
Those are the Steranko issues, yeah.
Yes, the Steranko ones are wonderful. But even looking at those sort of comics, while there might be some sort of political kind of stuff in there, certainly in the last decade or so, the Marvel movies have become, the storylines almost always revolve around the government in some capacity. Either they're fighting with the government, they're fighting against the government, or the government is always present. And then you look at the Suicide Squad. Now, while it's a box office flop at almost $1 billion, the whole premise behind that again is the sort of shadowy aspect of the government, some sort of shadowy cabal getting involved and recruiting them. And it's so funny seeing now with Tom King's Batman that he's getting involved in that. And again, it's sort of like that moving further into the dark side that the CIA kind of loves to embrace throughout all of its
question.
Throughout all of its sort of influence in movies and stuff like that. They're always sort of about going sort of farther, accepting. And again, I think that's why they would like a Batman type character. He does fit the mold of this sort of loner figure without parents, no worldly attachments. He is certainly open to moving into the dark side. So I find it again this sort of overarching politicization of all of these comics. I mean, what do you think about that and how it kind of fits into the world? Because I guess it's funny. I mean, it didn't take very long for this to happen in terms of the films, but maybe it did a bit with the comics. But now you are moving into a realm where you've got the biggest comic on the planet, Batman, and it's now he's working for the government. What do you think about this in the sort of larger context?
Well, I think as far as the basic premise of everything you're positing there, I agree with it all. And I think there's one other thing in there that we can discuss too, which is sort of the predictive value of the self-fulfilling prophecy value of a lot of big-time Hollywood films, in terms of they'll get an idea out into the zeitgeist, so to say, and not a reference to the movie, but, the overall cultural zeitgeist. And it kind of seeps in, and 10, 12 years later, these things bear fruit. Like, I'm sure you're familiar a bit with the history of The Exorcist.
Yes.
Which is, William Peter Blatty was a Phoenix program psychological warfare operative in Vietnam. And he writes this novel, The Exorcist. Huge success, and it's followed 10, 12 years later by the totally unfounded satanic panic. Okay? And things like demon possession and other nonsense kind of comes to be viewed as real again, thanks to the success of The Exorcist. Films like Rambo and Chuck Norris's Missing in Action went a long ways towards convincing people that there were still POWs in Vietnam. Even though I don't care how many bikers say there were almost none left over there. It was a total bullshit scam, because we didn't want to normalize relations with Vietnam and wanted an excuse not to pay him any reparations. And the minute we normalized trade relations with Vietnam, you never heard about the POW thing again. So the same thing has happened almost with the character of Tony Stark, I think, in the Marvel films. 10, 12 years ago, who would have imagined that we could ever embrace a self-absorbed, asinine, billionaire, egocentric as a hero? Happened in the movies, now it's happening in real life. So these things have a predictive value to them, whether by accident or design. You know what I mean? That just carries itself out. As far as why the government is interested in these things, I find it very interesting that, like in the latest Avengers films, obviously they're sort of showing that they're on different sides of, how shall we put it, a kind of should we be controlled by the government or should we not thing in that Captain America Civil War flick. And obviously it takes an editorial point of view that the uncontrolled, let us do our own thing sort of idea is the morally correct one. But at the end of the day, still, the Avengers, at the end of that second Avengers flick, are now an official government-sanctioned superhero team. So while they might be kind of moralistically saying, oh, this kind of freelance idea is right, at the end of the day, they're still working for the government. And the same thing's going on with this Batman storyline that we have going now, which is that you mentioned showing him more going to the dark side. This is really showing a darker internal side to Batman that we've ever seen before. Like in the recent issue, they revealed that he attempted suicide as a teenager, still upset and depressed over his parents' murder and stuff. And it's showing that he's just basically a hollowed out, kind of really empty shell of sadness type of character. And this is where his attraction and relationship with Catwoman apparently stems from, is that he recognizes that in her as well. And she's being imprisoned in this, she's working with him on this Bane assignment and trying to clear her name because she's been accused of killing 200 and some people. So it's really bizarre. They're turning longtime characters into mass killers, Catwoman killing 200 and some people, but at the same time trying to present them in a more sympathetic light than ever, and that these kind of very dark internal world they live in is kind of the background you need to be successful at these kind of covert mission type things.
Oh, and again, that's so spot on with the way that they appeal in terms of like recruitment with movies like The Recruit or even a Zero Dark 30. And you look at, say, Batman and the Suicide Squad sort of crossover. Again, it's like in so many ways they're saying this is the natural progression of a character such as Batman to basically embrace the more nefarious aspects of his personality, working with the government. It does kind of fit the pattern of normalizing that as well, I think. I think that's a totally. a big factor here, is that for whatever reason, in normalizing that behavior to the comic book culture, the people that are reading these sort of comics. And again, I think that's what's so kind of crazy and fascinating, is that's, I think, what is going on, say, with the Suicide Squad Batman combo right there. And it's funny too, you're saying that sort of normalizing mass killings and stuff. Again, this is so different from the comic books of not even that long ago, really. It would be it is outrageous to think of Catwoman as killing 200 people. Especially given that I think, for by and large there is this weird people like Catwoman, even though she is a villain, quote unquote.
Oh yeah.
And you would never have her doing something like that. And I don't know, maybe that's reflective of the times that we're in. But as you said, it does seem like they are creating this sort of larger project where this is all kind of par for the course. No, go ahead.
Yeah, Catwoman has served an interesting function in that she is definitely has, how shall I put this, sort of an anti-hero villainous appeal. And then definitely kind of the sex appeal angle of her over the years. But she's also served a interesting psychosexual safety valve for fans in that her constantly being in the background of Batman lets them kind of ignore the more obvious, sadomasochistic overtones of what Batman's probably personal psychosexual profile would be if he was a real character. I mean, Batman likes guys and he likes the rough stuff. Who are we kidding? And he likes to dish it out. He's not too keen on being on the receiving end. But I would say that if William Friedkin were making a Batman movie back in the era of cruising, it would fit in pretty well. Let's say. But the presence of Catwoman lets people kind of ignore some of the more, I hesitate to use the word disturbing because we shouldn't be disturbed by what anyone wants to do in their free time as long as it's legal, but the more controversial aspects of Batman's sort of psychological profile that have been there from the beginning. You don't dress up in leather and go out at night and beat up guys just for fun.
Yeah, no, I never even really thought or gone in that direction with Batman. Of course, I mean, it is all there. And Cruising, one of my favorite movies, one of the more disturbing, bizarre movies that come out of the 80s, but it's definitely worth watching.
Oh, yeah, that was shit. That was from the era of prime Friedkin, I'd say.
Yes.
From Exorcist through Sorcerer to Cruising to Live and Die in L.A. I mean, shit, that's a great movie. He was really on fire there for about a decade.
Yeah. No, and Cruising, one amazing soundtrack. A great, historical piece of New York City as well.
Oh, yeah. Dark Crash soundtrack? Shit.
Yeah, yeah. Getting back to Batman and comic book and superhero stuff. Yeah, I mean, again, I just keep kind of jumping back to you were just talking about the psychosexual profile. And again, this all seems to be in line with the with one type of individual that the CIA is interested in recruiting. They like the sort of criminal underbelly type person, and that is sort of Batman in many ways. Or he definitely he will resort to the tactics of his enemies in order to defeat them. Classic CIA behavior and mindset and thinking. And again, and maybe I'm jumping ahead because I haven't read the latest Batman stuff, but it does seem now, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there is this almost like this not vulnerability, but there's this like hole that Batman is trying to fill, and very much his working with the Suicide Squad and the government seems to be filling that. I mean, am I on the right track there? Or?
In a way, let's not. Again, don't make it think that he's just directly taking orders from the Suicide Squad and, they tell him what to do, their motives mesh with his, and then they leave him on his own. He's not working in the field with Amanda Waller or your Suicide Squad operatives. But I think what it opens the door to is down the road to them co-opting him again. And because this storyline has proven to be successful and is really the current last few issues of Batman that this storyline has been running. I mean, a non-comic book reader who went into the store, didn't know what the hell was going on, flipped them open and just looked at the pictures, would be like, I got to buy this because the art is that incredible right now. So I would say that it sets up future storylines, which they're going to need when you're cranking out 2 issues a month. You're looking at having to have maybe, 5-6 long-form storylines per year. So they'll go back to this well again, where they have Batman as the occasional government operative. And you're right. He fits a psychological profile of sort of a loner. They're showing him to be really heavily damaged and sort of romanticizing that psychological damage. And also King has said, when you mentioned the ends justifying the means and Batman being a natural fit for a sort of character who will co-opt his enemies' methods, King has said in interviews that he wants to see how far he can push Batman towards his dark side and how much Batman is willing to borrow, shall we say, his enemies' methods before he starts becoming like them. And he really wants to put him through the psychological ringer. And that's one interesting thing in a lot of these sort of, you were talking about Homeland, and I haven't seen it, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were subplots in there that showed people sort of morally and psychologically torn about what they were doing, and almost romanticizing that kind of mental anguish that people go through with this stuff.
Oh yeah, basically every season.
That's what it's about.
Well, I mean that's definitely one component throughout Homeland, and again I think that's a component throughout a lot of the CIA sponsored or CIA supported films that we have out there. Again, this sort of moral dilemma, but ultimately, well, you kind of have to make the decision, and ultimately you're going to make the decision that's going to support the quote greater good, whatever, and that's usually whatever prerogative the CIA has put out there. Interesting again that you talk about King wanting to kind of put Batman through the ringer, where by all accounts, he seemed to really enjoy what he was doing overseas, and God only knows what he was actually doing overseas. I was reading a quote from him in it was either a Washington Post interview or from another website, and he said that he loved being in war zones.
Yeah,
so
I saw that too. It's weird. The Washington Post almost never covers anybody related to comic books, but they've had a few articles in the last couple of years on King, and still love the guy. I think he lives in the Washington area to this day, or like the Arlington, Virginia area. So he's an easy phone call away or whatever, but they really do seem to be kind of greasing the wheels of his career a little bit.
Well, and that's what's so fascinating, this guy that basically comes out of nowhere. And going back a little bit to, we were talking about like in the first hour, this is a guy who is, he's married. I think he has 2-3 kids. He's got
2-3 kids, yeah.
Yeah. And he decides to leave the CIA. Now he claims it's because of the distance, he never got to see his wife and kids, he spent half of his time in Iraq or Afghanistan, like I said, doing God only knows what. That to me makes no sense. I mean, he could have easily just been asked to be sent to Langley. He could have been an analyst. He could have been training people.
Oh, sure, especially since he's got a home in that area.
Yeah, and you leave that comfort to the and you want to support your kids and your wife, and you just start doing comic books? You know, I mean, it's not like you're getting health care when you're a freelancing comic book writer.
Now, you know, we don't know. His wife might have a job that brings in the health insurance, but in any case, he's taken a massive pay cut. I don't know what they pay a CIA field operative. Actually, he was a case officer, full-blown case officer. So that's basically the CIA equivalent of a made man. Mm-hmm. If you are, you know, if you achieve the rank of case officer, you're good to go. You'll stay there until you retire. You'll get a full pension and things like that. And you go from that to, I mean, that guaranteed security when you've got a, you know, even if you don't necessarily need the insurance because your wife has some or something through her job, you've still got a mortgage to pay. You've still got kids you want to send to college. You've still got groceries you want to buy. To go from all that to a job with, as you say, no insurance for starters, low page rates right out of the gate, no security whatsoever, and chances are that you'll be toiling away for a year or two sending in spec scripts that get rejected.
Yeah, what is he's hired like on the spot, right?
Yeah, and like I say, it shows to me that they groomed him in because the first thing they did was they teamed him up with an established veteran writer on a book that was right in his wheelhouse with all this, a spy espionage type book, and kind of let him learn the tricks of the trade and things like that before they sent him out on his own with a solo writing assignment. But it's not like he had a stack of indie comics credits or small press credits to his claim that they could look at and say, hey, you've really got something here. That's usually how it works. You know, they usually poach their talent. The big two usually poaches talent from the small press or even from web comics now. King had no particular background, and it's interesting. He's one of the few writers out there who answers their own fan mail in a letter column of a book. This was in the Vision, okay, which is recently concluded. That 12 issues are up, but they would run a letters column every issue, and King would answer readers' letters directly, and you know, he would basically let slip some of these details. He'd be like, yeah, I was really nervous when I quit the CIA and got it, you know, it's just amazing. You know, we had the lack of stability and all this stuff. It was really nerve-wracking. Yeah, it is nerve-wracking, which is why I'm sure that you probably didn't really do it. And it's some kind of an assignment. You know, it's one thing if you're 25 years old and single, but when you're a 40-year-old dude with 2-3 kids, you're not going to make those kind of economically uncertain moves.
Yeah, especially to chase this dream of being a comic book writer. I mean, you know, I'm sure both of us have had that dream, but you know, you're not necessarily going to go out and do that.
No.
Fascinating too. Again, the idea that you know, you look at this guy on face value. Okay, he's an intern at Marvel in DC. He then goes to work at the Justice Department, and he was, we'll link up in the show notes, but he was involved in something like getting compensation for people that had been exposed to radiation through, I think it was, you know, through mishaps at work and stuff like that.
Yeah, that was a weird one.
Yeah, it's like, okay, so that, all right, fine, you know, somebody's got to do it, right? And then 9/11 happens, and he's so upset and feels it's his patriotic duty, and he just goes and joins the CIA and makes it. And not only does he make it, I mean, he's in the clandestine services. He's not just. It's funny in some of these interviews he talks about how mundane the CIA is, and you know, oh yeah, it is also just a lot of, you know, regular, you know, water cooler type characters, and you know, paper pushers and analysts, and you know, there's stains on the carpet and stuff, and you're also then thinking, well, when the fuck did you even see that? You know, you're out in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's pretty hush-hush about the process, how he made it into the CIA. But obviously, he had some sort of, there was something about him that the agency was liked a lot, and then it does make you sort of wonder and think, you know, what if, not even necessarily that the CIA was sort of helping direct his career, but what if this was the whole mission all along? You know?
I've thought that too, and then I sort of wonder if I'm getting a little bit too paranoid. You know what I mean? But it definitely seems to have those hallmarks to it in a way because, like you say, he starts out interning in comic books. At about the same time that comics' value in box office popular culture is taken off. Okay? Yeah. Late 90s and stuff like that. At a time, by the way, when the industry itself, the print industry, is really hurting at that point. But the box office is starting to take off. Then, 9/11 happens, and everyone else who was consumed with patriotic fervor generally just went down to the recruiting office and enlisted. He decides to join the CIA. But, you have to wonder if they looked at that background and said, here's a guy who, he's got this comic book thing going, and we've given him all the psychological testing, and he fits the profile of the kind of guy we're looking for. Maybe we'll send him to Iraq and get him a little field experience, and then when he comes back, we'll send him back on over to his old bosses at DC and Marvel and see what he can make of it there. Because, these things, the CIA looks ahead, and they see the IP, the intellectual property value of these comic book franchises. And they know that even though at the point, like I say, in the late 90s, that comics are struggling, they know that a lot of things that are being printed on the comics page now are going to be billion-dollar movie enterprises in 10 years, 12 years.
Oh, absolutely. They are very big picture, especially when it comes to the influence that they can have on culture. It's not just about, like back in the 50s, it wasn't just about having a few guys here and there in Hollywood. This was about creating an industrialized way where they could really dictate and control what Hollywood was putting out there. And again, when you look at the big picture of this again, when you think about the late 90s, that's when you started to get the Val Kilmer Batman movies became very, very popular. Huge, big sales, and you start to see that all the way up to Mr. CIA Ben Affleck becoming Batman, and then literal CIA agent Tom King writing Batman. And as you said, those storylines are going to be incorporated in some capacity in whatever future Batman project Ben Affleck is going to start churning out.
Oh, there's no question. And the other thing that we didn't really address with Ben Affleck is, like you say, the CIA seems to have helped or extended his career beyond its sell-by date. I'd say there's no better, more concrete proof of that than, who are we kidding? He's 10, 12 years older than anybody who's played Batman in a long time.
Yeah.
It's really amazing that a guy in his, what is Affleck, 45, 48, something years old? Yeah. Mostly when Bale was cast as Batman, he was maybe 30. I mean, Affleck, I think, is older than Michael Keaton was when he was cast in the part. So we've definitely got the oldest Batman we've seen in a long time.
That is another fascinating point. And again, it all just sort of reeks of that poking and prodding and making sure that Affleck's career continues even when it's in the shitter.
And they addressed that in. Did you see Batman versus Superman?
No, I did not actually.
We didn't miss a whole lot.
No.
But they addressed that in the movie where they're like, him and Alfred are sitting there talking and saying, we've been at this for 20 years in Gotham. So they're openly saying that he is an older hero that's been around for some time.
I think we should also point out, talking about Tom King, why the CIA might be interested. The CIA is also very interested in creative people. They've long employed creatives in their networks in Hollywood, but people can go and check out Matt Alford's book, The Writer with No Hands, all about Gary DeVore, Hollywood screenwriter who was hobnobbing with all sorts of intelligence folks, including CIA operatives, and was most likely down in Panama doing something with the CIA during when the U.S. invaded. So they certainly like creative types, and I think they They understand that they can exert a tremendous amount of influence through these people, through their creativity. But also, you're talking about people that kind of do think outside the box. Again, you look at Tom King. He fit some sort of profile. There was some reason that the CIA decides, not only are we going to hire you, we're going to send you into the two, our two war zones.
Yeah.
At the height of the war on terror. And, I mean, come on, King wasn't just hanging around in Iraq as a case officer, reading documents and,
No, he was in the green zone, from what I understand. And shit goes down there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, here's something interesting, too, to throw at you, Ryan. This guy, he's so affected by 9/11, he decides to join the CIA. And then, I mean, was he there? He wasn't in the agency for that long, right? I mean, several years, I guess. And then I'm done. I guess, the war on terror, that'll just sort itself out. I'm going to go do comic books now. That doesn't even make any sense.
No, it's really weird. On paper, really, I'm not prepared to say that some of this isn't sort of spun for publicity value by his publishers, because DC clearly loves having this guy in their ranks.
Definitely, yeah. You'd
think they'd kind of be sort of, whatever. But even when news breaks, like Sheriff of Babylon scripts are being vetted, DC puts that out there like they're proud of it. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, this book is so fucking. Oh, excuse my language.
No, you can curse. You can curse, Ryan.
Okay, this book is so fucking authentic that we've got to get CIA clearance to publish every issue. I mean, they're bragging about it. Somewhere like, I don't know, man. Somewhere Alan Moore is just shaking his head at this shit.
Well, of course, the so many people read comic books to be kind of, like the sort of, fuck the system kind of a thing.
Right.
That's such a prevalent motif in comic books, and then I know to see them wetting themselves over the CIA connection is very scary. Maybe. We're getting up towards...
It shows a cultural shift among the superstar creative people in comics. Obviously, Tom King is a star on a rise. His profile is increasing. And in decades past, the top stars in comics were either just otherworldly creative dynamos who had something that none of us will, like Jack Kirby, right? Mm-hmm. Who's like touched by the hand of God, or however you want to put it, to just crank out so much mind-blowing material. I think Grant Morrison called him the William Blake of the 20th century, and it's probably true. And then later, the next generation of wave were definitely anti-conformists. Your Grant Morrisons, your Alan Moores, your Peter Milligans, people with a definite fuck the system point of view. And then there was kind of a transition period where we saw guys like the previous Batman writer, Scott Snyder, who's not a rabble-rouser or a nonconformist or anything of any sort. He's definitely a talented writer, but he doesn't really seem to have much of a political point of view and is just very satisfied to turn in a good script, and is obviously a very buttoned down, almost, company guy, really. He's totally a company guy. I remember reading a text piece by Snyder where he's talking about his days as a Disney World worker, right? And he actually says, me and my fellow cast members, which is like that bullshit corporate, they don't call them workers there.
Yeah.
But
right.
Nobody outside of like top management refers to themselves as a goddamn cast member. But he said, so this tells me that, this Snyder guy was a pretty buttoned down corporate guy. So it's like there was a transition going on. And now we've got the full blown co-opted system stooge as the top writing talent in comics. So things have definitely changed since the days of the British invasion of the 80s, where you had genuine radicals moving into the comics sphere, and they've all moved on. They've all moved on.
Well, again, as you were saying before, Ryan, with the a character like an Iron Man, and I think I've stated this before, I think on various shows, but I cannot stand Robert Downey Jr. in general, and I can't either. His portrayal of Iron Man is why should we be admiring this arms dealing, government stooge, basically,
megalomaniac while you're at it?
Complete nut job transhumanist, and we should idolize him. He's good, and. We were talking off air before. I'm a big fan of the comic series Lazarus. You've got a comic where, the whole premise of that, again, is basically these powerful feudal families basically taking over the entire planet. These family corporations taking over the planet, dividing it up. Everyone is after, the few remaining GMO seeds that are left. And again, this sort of nightmare of a transhumanist world run amok. And then at the same time, you've got DC, again, praising the CIA, thinking this is cool, normalizing the most abhorrent behavior in the one of the most influential comics of all time. So I guess, Ryan, before we kind of close out the episode, where do you see this going? Because, again, the comic industry doesn't really seem to care too much.
No, the comics industry, where I see it going as part of, in its own subculture and in the larger culture, doesn't really change much. I would say that as far as the box office goes, comics will continue to rule the roost until they won't. At some point, you'd think the bubble's got to burst, but something seems to be happening where this is kind of stuck in the public conscience as a successful movie genre in a way that nothing has really since the heyday of the Western. So I think we're probably looking at about 10, 12 more years of comic book superhero dominance at the box office until that runs out of steam. And in that time, I can guarantee you that Tom King will probably not only have seen his work adapted into a couple of Batman flicks, but may have even worked his way into DC Studios in the same way that their new head honcho there, this guy Jeff Johns, who's now in charge of all the DC films, came over from the comic book side. I definitely feel like King is personally being groomed for positions like that down the road. His career has all the hallmarks of it. And as far as within the comic book industry, I think that they are going to keep on doing what they're doing in terms of the really creative folks will try to make a name for themselves for a couple of years working at the big two and then go for the creator ownership and to do the projects they really love at places like Image. And that's going to keep on going on. I mean, those are if you look at like the television lineups in every season, we're seeing more and more comic book properties being adapted, not just for the big screen, but the small screen. So comic books don't need to be a million seller anymore in order to have value as an IP farm for the big Hollywood studios. And as long as that relationship, everything should keep on going on. But my prediction personally for Tom King is that he's being groomed for larger things. They have Jeff Johns doing double duty as head of DC Studios Films and chief creative officer for DC Comics. That can't last forever. Sooner or later, Johns will probably just be doing the movie side only, and I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Tom King move into a position like chief creative officer or a deputy publisher or something at DC Comics and be groomed to kind of move over to the Hollywood side.
We're hitting the end of the show here. We're on the break. Where can people go to find your work?
Trashfilmguru.wordpress.com or dailygrindhouse.com. Those are the, and I pop up on other sites here and there too, but you can find me there all the time.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, friend.
Thank you.
All right, I will be talking to you all very soon.
news and information you can trust. This is American Freedom Radio. Freedom, American Freedom Radio. American Freedom Radio.